Welcome to the show, everybody. My name's Dave Whitley, and today I have a guest, Greg Landess, who we were just talking a little bit before I started recording. Um, Greg was born in New York, and he's done everything from growing food and owning a restaurant to running a music label, moving company, teaching fitness and martial arts is what we were talking about on the front end there. He's looking at building intentional communities based on permaculture and entrepreneurship, which is fascinating, a little bit confusing to me. I know entrepreneurship, my permaculture knowledge and my permaculture kung fu is not strong, seafood. So,
Not yet, not yet.
he's got, but from the little bit of conversation we've had on the front end, apparently, and we've known each other we met rather a long time ago, but we've reconnected for this show. He was one of the guys that reached out to me when I announced that I was going to do the show. Got a unique perspective. Been all over the place. I'm looking at a list of stuff here: China, Japan, Cape Verde, and a bunch of other places that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. Swaziland, I never even heard of that. He's been all over the place. He's CEO of the family nonprofit For Our Children's Sake Incorporated, and he deemed it interesting enough to include on the questions that I asked on the front end, and I'm glad that he did. Is that first concert was Pink Floyd, and I love this one. Muhammad Ali gave you a kiss on the forehead when you were 5 years old. So, Greg, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation, getting to know more about you. What has been going on in your life for the past however many years it's been since we initially met back at an old RKC Level 2 event in Minneapolis. And yeah, let's just jump into it. Greg, thanks a lot for being here, and tell me how you're doing, bro.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. It's an honor to be talking with you here. Again, I've always held you in high esteem. I love the work that you do. So couldn't be in a better place right now. In terms of how I'm doing, loaded question, right? In honesty, I think this whole life is a bit surreal. There's highs and lows, and I'd kind of have it no other way. I'm a big fan of just getting experience and learning. And it's been a journey, just kind of enjoying the ride. I don't take it for granted that we're all just sharing some time here on the earth, and it's a one-way ticket. Just got to make the most of it.
Yeah, and the one thing that I neglected to say when I was introducing you is, which is like was the genesis of me starting this whole show in the first place, is you've got two kids, a
Yep,
son that's 12
absolutely.
and a daughter that's 7. So we will definitely cycle
Yes.
through some dad life topics while we're on here. But like I always talk about, I'm here to talk about things that I think are cool with people that I think are cool, who also think that the things that I think are cool are cool. So
Yep. Right
um
on.
so lead the way, man. Let's talk a little bit. I told you on the front end that something that, or not on the front end, but I told you when before I hit record, something that was really cool. Your Instagram is Koga Greg, and you were
Yep.
telling me a little bit about your martial art experience. So I have something I want to show you, but I want you to go into a little more detail about what you were telling me when I said, wait, I've got something cool to show you. Let's save it for the
Yep.
show. Go ahead.
Um, well, I mean, I could tell you about kind of my life in martial arts to some extent. Basically, I started when I was 5 years old. There was a
And
Sato,
what year would that have been? Because I don't remember.
87, 1987. Yeah.
Okay.
I had an older brother who was already participating in martial arts. And so I started taking those classes with him. It was a Sato martial arts dojo on 23rd Street in New York. Great school. I had a great time there. And then I was lucky enough growing up in New York. There's just so many great masters here. Like they say, you don't choose the martial arts choose you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much kind of serendipity to the whole path. On one hand, you can be, really want to train, but maybe there's no good schools near you. Or maybe, the best masters is right around the corner. You're not even into it, but you just kind of fall into the class kind of thing. But luckily I had the desire. I had an older brother, I could tell you two of my main motivations, or I guess my three main motivations. I had an older brother who I wanted to be able to beat in a fight. Second, I guess I watched all these Steven Seagal movies, and I really wanted to be able to take out a whole room of bad guys kind of thing. And then I guess I had some vision from I don't know, Saved by the Bell or something, that some guy could beat you up and take your girlfriend in high school or something. So those were like my three main motivations, but luckily I kind of got the bug. Again, growing up in New York, I went to a lot of different schools, and that's kind of one thing I'd recommend. Is just try a bunch of schools if you're looking to get into martial arts and see where you kind of vibe, what feels right. And I had all of my brother's friends, they were all going to different schools. Somebody mentioned ninjutsu to me. Instantly, I was like, oh, that sounds fantastic. I had the honor of training with Grandmaster Ronald Duncan. So basically, I was training. I went to a bunch of schools, and then at 11, I found Ronald Duncan, and I never looked back. The school was fantastic. I remember I was, 12, 13, and I would take the adult class on Tuesdays and Thursday nights, and it was like a lot of law enforcement, military dudes. I remember I don't want to I don't know if you need to shout him out, but he has the best name, Bill Hardcastle. He was like a 230-pound cop who I used to like judo throw when I was like 12, And then we had a gun range downstairs in the dojo. Master Duncan was very serious, and he was always a father to me, so he's definitely worth mentioning here.
Definitely.
And then his son kind of took over, and I've been training with his son. Not enough, but that's my family. Yeah.
All right. To the point of when you said Sensei Duncan, who has there's a legitimate claim there to being one of, if not the fathers of American ninjutsu. I'm a bit older than you. 1987, I was graduating high school, so a few years older, not too much. And
Yep.
I was there for the ninja boom, for the ninja craze as a teenager.
Yep.
For like all the Sho Kosugi and Michael Dudikoff movies and
Yep.
Chuck Norris, right? Was it the Octagon? Was that the one that was where he fought the ninjas?
It sounds familiar. I'm so bad with names, but yep.
Yeah. So I was the guy who really wanted to train. I was the kid who really wanted to train, but there was nothing. There was no one. I lived out in the country. There was nothing
Yep.
at all to do martial art wise. But that didn't stop me from buying the magazines, right?
Yep.
And when I was probably 13 or 14 years old, when all that stuff first started coming into the public eye, and ninja was a thing, my initial exposure to it, I guess, was the mini series called Shogun.
Yep.
And so there were ninja on there. It was set in, for anybody that doesn't know, it was set in feudal Japan, and there was this white guy that shows up, and he like has to learn the culture, and it's a pretty interesting little mini series that they did back then. But I got sort of enamored of ninja as a martial art idea, right? And before that, it was just Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, and it was just like all the kids would do. We would go out and try to kick each other in the head and make whoa,
Yep.
and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Right? But I was in a vivid memory of this. I was in a drugstore, probably like a Walgreens or CVS type thing like that, with my mom when I was about 13 or 14 years old. And I loved to read. I loved comic books. And this is before all the magazines and stuff got published. But I was in the paperback section. And at that time, I was like really caught up in like Conan the Barbarian and all the paperback stuff that was going on then. And I saw this book right here. Do you have this book?
Absolutely. That's fantastic.
Okay.
I love it.
And so when you said Ron Duncan, literally
That's legit. That's a real one.
very first thing that popped into my mind, because I think in images, right?
Yep.
The very first image that popped into my mind was a picture from this book that I've got to find. And here it is. Sensei Duncan with a
Yep.
short Manriki chain there. And I'm like, that is such a cool picture. And like I had seen on TV, Enter the Dragon, and
Yep.
for some reason, well, the reason's pretty obvious. Like, I mean, he looked like real life Jim Kelly's character to me from Enter the Dragon. And I picked up a copy of this book, and then got a little bit older, moved out of the house, never trained proper ninjutsu. But are you familiar with Hoshin Budo, Dr. Glenn Moore?
Not in particular. I don't want to say I am.
Okay. That's a whole different conversation we can go into. But when I moved,
I know the Budokan. I know some of the other schools, but yeah.
Yeah. Glenn Morris was he died in 2006. I think he was posthumously given a ninth Dan in Bujinkan, but so
Mhm.
he was in with Hatsumi and all those guys. But
Yep.
he started his own esoteric and very effective um, system of martial arts training called Hoshin Budo, right?
Okay.
And I've got a third Dan in that myself.
Oh, excellent.
A lot of emphasis on meditation, energy cultivation, healing, all
Yep.
that stuff. And to be completely 100% transparent, like if you want to come and learn the basics of Hoshin combatives, I'm not your
Mhm.
guy because I don't really
Mhm.
practice that. But the meditation and the healing aspect of it is what really appealed to me. And I wound up becoming friends with the current grandmaster and one of the top level students there. So that's a whole different thing. Actually, I need to get both those guys on this show. But this particular book, here's the really cool thing about this book. When I moved out after high school, my mom got rid of a bunch of my stuff, sold it,
Mhm.
took it away, yard sale, whatever. And this book was among those things. And I'm like, several years ago when I reconnected with my interest in all things ninja because of Hoshin, I'm like, what was that book called? Oh yeah, it was Clan of Death. Who could forget that? So
Yep. Yep.
I went and I found a used copy of it online because I think it's out of print, and it got mailed to me. And I took it out and I opened it up and I'm like, this is awesome. And I'm looking, and if you can see, there's some little pencil scribble right there, right?
Okay. Mhm.
And I'm like, well, that looks familiar. And then the kicker for it, I don't know if you can see it, but like right there, as the light hits
Mhm.
it, there's little dents in
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Those teeth marks. And it turns out that I got back the original copy. Those are my teeth marks from when I was a kid.
You
And
know,
I
it's funny. I'm not
bunch of stuff.
surprised.
Yeah. And I'm like, that is amazing. And also, like I said, not surprising, but the book came back to me. It's like I could not escape it. So when you said that about Ron Duncan, I'm like, I got to show Greg this because this is fascinating. This
It's
book,
not a coincidence.
not a coincidence at all. The majority of the stuff in here, if anybody wants to read it, is about the history and a lot of stuff that is probably, you could probably debunk a lot of what's in here as misinformation now. But I think the book was published in like 1982 or something. Um,
Mhm.
81. So yeah, the book's old, not, ancient feudal Japan old, but
Yeah.
yeah, I had no idea when you said, "Hey, I want to come be on the show," that this is where this is going to go. But like, this is really cool. So
I encounter this type of coincidence all the time where I've learned life's just full of it. You just have to open your eyes and everything's
mhm,
connected in that sense.
mhm.
And it's also very appropriate because Master Duncan's absolutely a father for me, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Which makes sense because we're going to talk dad stuff too as we're going here. Now you mentioned something, and I think this the serendipity of that ties into this. You mentioned something earlier, or I asked you a question about it earlier because it's something that you wrote down when we were talking initially about getting you on the show. Something called totipotency. First of all, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Basically, I'm not a linguist when it comes to that, but totipotency, I would say, yeah, totipotency.
Totipotency. Okay. Um,
Yeah,
I
yeah. You,
saw
you
the
put a
word.
little twang on there, but yeah,
Well, I am from Tennessee, so totipotency. That sounds like that some dude that lives down by the railroad tracks, right?
yeah,
Old man potency's
yeah.
boy. But yeah, I saw the word. I know what potency means. Didn't know what the word itself meant. I asked you, and you said about 4 or 5 words, and I said, "Stop, Greg.
Yep.
Save it for the show. I want, I want to know about this." Like I've said so many times before, this show is two guys having a conversation, and you brought information to the conversation that I am largely unfamiliar with. So, talk to me about totipotency.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I get almost like a little excited. I don't want to get too tangential with it, but it's very much an essence of my spirituality. Again, we could have a whole conversation about spirit and religion and whatnot. But what I can tell you is that I'm basically very literal. I was raised Unitarian Universalist on my mom's side, and then kind of Jewish slash atheist on my dad's side. And a big part of my religion, I mean, aside from just feeling like in touch with nature and whatnot, was valuing what I can see with my own eyes. Right. So it's like, I know when it comes to a higher power, for example, I'm not an egomaniac. I know I can't create all of this, right? And I know that you and I could do more than I could do myself. So the higher power that I valued was kind of what I could see with my own eyes. And so Totipotency, I went to SUNY Cobleskill for agronomy, which is the study of plant and soil science for the production of crops. And I learned this in my plant propagation class, and it's called Totipotency. Basically, what it means is the ability of a single cell to replicate an entire organism, right? So again, I don't know if you know about like differentiated versus undifferentiated cells and stem cells and whatnot. So basically, when you're first formed, your cells could become anything, and then once they become something, they can't become something else. So for example, like your liver cell can't make a heart cell, for example, right? But some plants and some organisms, like a tomato, for example, you could take a single cell from anywhere on a tomato plant and it could create an entire tomato plant. Right. So now what this means, if you believe in or understand evolution, for example, it means that theoretically a single cell can bring life to an entire planet. Right. So if you look at everything that you see, all the good, all the bad, all the thousands of years of history and everything, theoretically, all of that power is in a single cell. And we're made up of trillions of cells.
When you say all of that power, you mean like the potential power for the
of life and history and everything that we know as a human species.
Single organic cell. Okay, go ahead.
Yep. And again, that's theoretical. You can't just take a skin cell and, go populate Mars kind of thing. But
Sure.
That life force, as I figure out what's the difference between, us and some rocks floating in space, at some part, there was a spark in life that said, hey, this chemical, this potential energy, it needs to manifest into something greater to, to keep things going. So again, it's a big, so often we're devalued. I feel like in this world, they basically put a dollar amount on everything. And our worth is basically synonymous with your bank account kind of thing. And I just think it's important for everybody to know that you have this tremendous potential inside of you. And so, yeah, that's an essence for me.
That's amazing.
There's even nucleototipotency, where you don't even need a cell. You just need the nucleus. So that's a whole other thing, but just the DNA, and you can do all that.
That is that's fascinating. So tell me more about how that relates to a path of spirituality. Because like I can see from like a biological standpoint, I can see where you're looking at theoretically there. And
yep,
we can't prove that, but we can't disprove it either. So like how does that ingrain with a path of spirituality, specifically more of like
yeah. So
one of the
and again, my brain just instantly my brain instantly goes to this place when you say that. Again, I don't want to get too tangential, but again, I'm very literal for the most part, and I'm trying to figure stuff out. And a big part of it too is that growing up mixed, my mom black, my dad white, I've always been a bit of an outcast, in all honesty. And I've always, also there's a whole other thing, but my mom used to work for UNICEF, so I used to spend a lot of time like in the United Nations and hearing about all these world issues. And I've always just been on this quest for understanding, right? And when I look at the things that kind of unite us, it's this spark of life, all right? It's a big part of it. Now, it makes me think, I went to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition as well. I graduated from there. It was a great program. And one of my favorite days there, we had, I forget the gentleman's name, but the guy who wrote Fast Food Nation. We used to sit in an auditorium, it was about 2,000 of us, and speakers would come. And he gave a presentation. It was one of my favorite presentations. Part of it was because he was an author. So he was telling a story versus like the doctors and stuff who were talking to us.
Right.
And after he spoke, the whole auditorium stood up, standing ovation. And I just had a moment of almost despair, right? Where I thought, man, this guy had to preach to the choir for an hour for us to stand up and clap, when the opposition is spending millions of dollars every moment to get another agenda across, right? And what I realized there is that it's not 50-50, right? Life often feels like this 50-50 thing. I don't know if anybody else can relate, but, the dichotomy of man, the duality, and I realized, it doesn't take 50% to make a change. right? If there's 100 of us walking through the forest and one person finds a better path, that's all it takes, right? And so basically, I'm saying that what I realized in terms of the, you know, I believe part of intelligence is understanding complexities,
Okay.
but then there is a binary nature to our existence too. And when I think about what really are the two sides, for me, it ultimately comes down to what exists and what doesn't exist, right? So there's existence and non-existence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, non-existence, it's, I don't even mean like an empty space. It's not an empty room, right? It's not a void. It's absolute nothing. It's not even a thought,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what I realized is that, the calling of the void, we all have this thing to just be like, oh, forget it. Let's throw in the towel kind of thing. But I was like, you know what? For now, I'm on the side of life. I'm on the side of existence. And that's the side that I'm going to choose. Right. So, and like I said, existence, like to me, I look at a rock and my mind's blown. I'm like, oh my God, like, how does this thing even exist? Like, where did this thing come from? And then if you understand a little bit of a science, you realize that, wow, this thing is made of vibrating atoms. It's in constant motion.
Mm-hmm.
And then you hear about like 99.9% of everything is empty space.
Space,
And
yeah.
I'm just like, like the whole thing is just, it's like, you have to keep that wonder. So to tying it all back into totipotency, it's just about the fact that we exist and the power of life. In my darkest moments, it's like, if you're breathing, if you're alive, I mean, it's been said in cliche in many ways, but it's not to be overlooked.
Yes, not to be overlooked for sure. Um, as you're saying that, the and I understand what you mean by that. The analogy of 100 people walking through the woods, and it only takes one person to find a better path. Um, really, it brought that into a level of understanding for me, because if we are mostly made up of empty space, if everything is mostly empty space, the parts of us that the part of me that is speaking to the part of you through the internet, and that is this computer and this desk and that bookshelf behind you, all of that is that one person who's choosing that path, right?
Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
everything else falls into line behind it, or it doesn't. And if it
Yep.
doesn't, then it becomes nothing or non-existent, right?
Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
um you triggered. I've talked before about how when I was a kid, I was overweight and I had a stutter and all that sort of stuff. You've triggered little stuttering me right now, because rarely am I at a loss for words, and usually when stuttering little boy me shows up, you can't get the words out because there's too many ideas trying to come out of my mouth at the same time. And so, like, I have all these thoughts right now based on what you just said it's just ultimately fascinating. But in an effort to kind of put that into a calm place that we can carry on an intelligent conversation, one of the first things that came to mind when you said that was, are you familiar with Wallace Wattles?
No, not yet.
Oh boy. Wallace Wattles wrote a book, was published in 1910, I think, called The Science of Getting Rich. Yeah. And it's almost never more than arm's length away from me, right? And it's you know, it's a cool title, and it sounds like it's all about going out and doing business strategies and all that sort of stuff. It's not, although that evolves very naturally from it. I actually have a course that I put together where I teach the information in there. It's very much a spiritual understanding of what we can know about the laws of the universe way to align ourselves with abundance and wealth and prosperity and that sort of stuff. And I realized as I was saying it, and my ears heard what my mouth was saying, everything I just said sounded like a cliche Instagram meme, right? Aligning for abundance and prosperity and all that. But those words mean things. And when you said that, I went and I grabbed and pulled up um a digital copy of the the Science of Getting Rich, and I'm going to read this to you. This is from chapter 5, which is called Increasing Life. And prior to this, he talks about I'm there it is, like all the ideas, right? Along with everything that you just described, do you have or what is your level of familiarity with either the Kybalion or the Seven Hermetic Principles?
Kabbalion's one of my favorite books.
Okay. All right, then.
Yep.
That will make all this make more sense. The first principle from the Kybalion is that the universe is mental. It is a it is a mind expressing itself. Everything,
Exactly.
right? And so throughout the book, Wallace Wattles, he doesn't reference Kybalion. Actually, I think Kybalion hadn't even been published yet when he wrote this book. The Hermetica was around, but Kybalion hadn't been published yet, because that was the three initiates who we found out later was William Walker Atkinson, was a nom de plume, if you will. I think I may be wrong on that. But anyway, he references this thinking stuff, and he gives it multiple names as he goes through it. He calls it substance, he calls it the formless, calls it the thinking stuff. And like the very first principle is there is a thinking stuff from which all things are made, right? Which, if you look at it from that point of view, it is depending on what your own conditioning and what your own paradigm and internal code that you live in, you will assign a different name to that. But it is, if we look at Taoism, it's the thing that can't be named, right? But so here's what that made me think of as you were talking about all things coming from one's, or all life potentially coming from one cell. In this particular chapter, he refers to it as the intelligent substance because it's a thinking substance, right? He says, the intelligent substance, which is all, and mind is all, and in which lives all, lives in you, is a consciously living substance. Being a consciously living substance, it must have a natural and inherent desire of every living, it must have the natural and inherent desire of every living intelligence for an increase of life. Every living thing must continually seek for the enlargement of its life, because life in the mere act of living must increase itself. So when you said totipotency and gave me your definition of it, my neurons said, hey, Dave, you've heard this something similar before. So
same page. And I think it's also important to kind of distinguish. So in terms of like tangibles and dealing with what is, on one hand, there's just biomass, right? We could just like grow more grass, but then there's also an intelligence that comes into it, right? And there's this ability to really create. And ultimately, I mean, this is a whole other thing too, but I believe the only value anything has is the value we place on it, right? One person could look at a Picasso and say, oh, I want to pay 32 million for it. The other person could say, this is garbage, put it in the trash, kind of thing. And it really is what we make it.
Yeah. And like to that point, I think that our perspective, our point of view defines things like that. But like, if you look at someone like Jackson Pollock, right? I don't know how familiar you are with Jackson Pollock, but I really like stuff. Like when I look at his stuff, I see controlled chaos. I see an expression of controlled chaos, which if you look at his life, very much the same kind of thing. It's like, to me, Jackson Pollock and Jim Morrison were very much parallel, right? But like, one person can look at Jackson Pollock and just marvel at it and just be overwhelmed by it to the point that words escape. That's not me, but like I can appreciate it. So I'm in the middle of where I'm talking about. And then on the other end of the continuum of that, to go back to the Kybalion, everything, there's a polarity to it, right? The other end of that is the person who looks at it and says, well, that's just a bunch of paint splattered on a canvas. I could do that. But you didn't. And fact is, not only you didn't, you couldn't, because you don't possess what it would take to go through everything that it took to get to the point to be able to just splatter paint and make it make sense. Right?
So, I mean, that's, again, so many thoughts. It's funny. It's concentrated conversation. So for me, I've only considered in terms of art, right? I've been surrounded by artists growing up in New York and whatnot. My mom has an art collection, all this stuff. For me, the only art I was really interested in was martial art, right? And for me, that was always my art. I did a little bit of music and stuff. And then later, entrepreneurship, I consider business and art.
Absolutely.
So as I'm in this phase of my life, I am feeling a creative urge, right? An urge to create more, right? And I think it's something that's ingrained in us if you let it express itself. So it was funny. I took my kids to a museum. I think it was MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and so many pieces there. One thing was just like a white canvas. The guy just painted white on a white canvas. It's like $30 million. And you're looking at this stuff and you're like, man, I could do that. You know, and some of it you're like, man, this is, you know, what is this? This is garbage or whatever. But I think the essence of it, the reason these pieces stand out is because they were so unconventional. They were pushing boundaries. So at the time, it was, you know, now we look back and like, oh, you know, we have Instagram and all this other stuff, YouTube, whatever.
Right.
So what's a white canvas? But at the time, it was like this completely, you know, extraordinary concept to do something like that. So my point in saying all that, I think that's really what life is about in many ways, and that's kind of where I am now. You know, like, and this is a whole other story too, but like Formula One, I'm a fanatic, right? I love motorsports, I love motor racing. And one of the things that I know, and you'll see this with a lot of great athletes, a lot of great, extraordinary people. So let's say a car, or let's say a tire, it can only go 100 miles per hour. Let's say that's the limit, all right? Most people get in the car and they'll go 50 and maybe 60 and 70 and then 75. You know, they start getting sketched out. And, you know, a race car driver, they get in there, they go 110 right off the bat,
Right.
and say, okay, that's the limit. Let's pull it back a little bit. So there's just so much to be said for challenging yourself, realizing where the limit is and working there rather than in mediocrity, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to the point of appreciating art, I am, or have been in the past at least, a musician. I play guitar, used to do it
I think I've
professionally.
seen, yep.
Yeah. When you said about Formula One, I know nothing about cars. Very, like, nothing, right? But when you're talking about, if we're talking about visual art, let's say specifically painting, again, my brain, my mind, I look for patterns.
Yep.
And okay, what's the pattern here? If we look at, let's say, the realism of something like, you know, Mona Lisa, or you know, Michelangelo's work from the Renaissance, it was like you could, if you've ever seen any of that stuff up close, real life, it literally looks like, if you get really close to it, you can start to see those individual cells that are expressing that life, right? But from whatever distance it was intended to express, it looks like they could, if it's a person, like say Mona Lisa or whatever, I've seen that, the
Yep.
actual Mona Lisa, it looks like she could just walk out of the painting and start talking to you, or turn her head and wave at you, right? That level of realism. And I think that the public, the people who are ignorant, in the sense of they're just uneducated, not ignorant as in like, you know, rude or stupid or whatever, just like they just don't know anything. Because you said about Formula One, I'll be the first one to admit I'm ignorant about Formula One. That's the cars that have the wheels that come way out to the sides.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And they don't run in a circle. I just gave you my entire body of knowledge about Formula One and Mario Andretti, right? And I'm done.
Yep.
But if we look at visual art like that, I think that the general public will have more of an appreciation for something like that, because they can look at it and recognize the level of technical skill that must be present to produce something like that.
Yep.
It's so easy to see something like that in Jackson Pollock. They don't see the level of technical skill that goes into something like that. And then to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, it's a white canvas painted white. What level of technical skill goes into that? Maybe none, you know? I mean, like, we're talking about the ability to like just physically do it, but the vision behind it and
Exactly.
the that goes into it that's inherently there. To me, that's much like, you know, Bach, and then Van Halen, and then like punk rock, you know?
Yep. Absolutely.
And ultimately it comes back to the whole idea of life's purpose is to express itself. And each one of us that sprang forth from that one little cell, however many billions of years ago, we all have that desire to express. We all have that desire to expand. And that's literally the purpose, not the meaning, but the purpose of life. And I'm glad that I got you on here, because you coming from a biological, what'd you call it?
Agronomy.
Agronomy background, and finding the patterns between agronomy and a spiritual understanding. that's amazing to me. So it's again, pattern recognition. I see we have much in common, and then we have areas of our lives that I have no knowledge of, right?
Mhm.
But you're expressing it to me in such a way that I can relate it back to something that I have a deep knowledge of.
Mhm.
And ultimately that tightens the bond, not just between two men talking, but also I think that anytime two individual consciousnesses that are dwelling in a meat suit can come together and vibrate in a harmoniously in a conversation like this, even if we're not on the same level of vibration, we're on harmonious vibration, right? So like to
Yep.
use a music analogy, if we build a chord, we have a chord by definition must have at least three notes in it. And
Mhm.
one of those notes is off in its vibration by a little bit, we get dissonance, we get discord.
Mhm.
And if they're all vibrating in perfect harmony with each other, we get resonance and we get that harmony, right? And so um, it's cool too, because when I decided to start doing these interviews with people, and I never imagined that I would be having conversations like this one, where I'm like, I'm vibrating at a frequency that I knew that I had, but have never really harmonized in exactly the same way, right? So yeah, there's art and science to everything. So
Yep.
we're jamming right now, or we're racing right now. However you want to look at it, that's what we're doing. Um, so
Yep.
where I want to take this, unless you had something really pressing that you wanted to say in response to that, where I want to take this
Yep.
is, and if you do have something pressing, I want to hear it. But when you're done with that, I want
Yep. I'm with you.
direction of you've got a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old. You mentioned taking them to the museum. You mentioned very different backgrounds, not only being biracial, but also like philosophically, because you said, I forget what you said about your mom, but your dad was atheism and a Jew, right?
Yep.
So
Yep. Exactly.
when you say that, my thought is like it's all the ritual with none of the connection to source, right?
Mhm.
That's my thought on it. And if I misinterpret that, then please educate me. I want to hear you speak on all of that and how that affects the relationship that you have with your kids, because our kids, by definition, are our attempt to increase life. It's to expand and increase that life and to propagate not just the biological urge to propagate the species, but also the elevation of consciousness from generation to generation. So whatever you want to say, I'm throwing the ball back to you. Run with it.
Oh man, so much. This conversation can literally go every direction, and I love it. So many things you're saying, like you say, it resonates in terms of the harmony of it. One of my friends, professors, used to say a big part of intelligence is pattern awareness,
Yeah,
and
I can see
and I
that.
believe that it's also understanding complexities and whatnot. So I could see that we're we got the whole field covered here. Um, yeah, in terms of the fatherhood, it changes everything, as you know. And it's funny, metaphysically they say in some ways your kids choose you. You don't just choose them. They're kind of like, hey, I'm ready, make me, time to make me. And it's interesting, I've learned that the biological need to kind of reproduce, obviously some people feel it more than others, but in many ways it's a strong driving force, just like our need for food, air, water, shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you need water, it's like something in you and saying, I need to create another person. you know
Yeah.
and it's such a mad world. It's a little scary. Part of it, I was teaching kids at the time, and I saw parents who seemingly had everything together, but the kids were total wrecks. And I was like, I could do this. I could do this. And the reality is, I think that the world needs more good folks. So it's total honor to be a parent, and then to have amazing kids and to be blessed with that too. It really does drive you into and create you into something that you weren't necessarily expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still figuring it out too, because when you're a parent too, first, there's no manual on it. I mean, I did buy a little manual, but there's no real manual on how to be a parent. And that first stage, when they're an infant, when they're a toddler, it just feels like it's forever.
Yeah.
uh, but obviously it's not. And what I learned is that, what, your kids need you for decades to come. um it's so easy to get stuck in the moment, and like, we're the only species, to my knowledge at least, that can really realize that, hey, what we do now is going to affect us 10, 20 years down the line.
Right.
Most of us don't necessarily live in that space. I find that most of us are very reactionary, just constantly reacting to everything that's happening to us. But when you act from a centered place, you say, okay, hey, what do you want to do? So now I just turned 41, and it's funny, we always feel like, yeah, thank you. So, we feel like, there's not enough time. On the other hand, it's like, I've lived a lifetime, So now as I'm stepping into the future, I'm like, how do I want to be the architect of the next bunch of years of my life? And, I think that's really what it comes down to as well, is really the simple question of what is the world that we want to create? All of the challenges that we face, it's like, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's a big part of it too. So, tying it back into the universe and the harmony, I've seen so many coincidences, right? I can go on and on with like a long list of these things. When my father died, at the funeral, a number of things came up. I learned at the funeral that my stepmother's birthday was my parents' wedding anniversary. And again, 1 in 365 chance, whatever.
Right.
I also learned that the last place my brother saw my dad was on the stairs of the West 4th Street train station. And that's the same place my parents met. Right. Now, again, we're in New York, okay. But what I realized is that these things that seem like coincidence, everything's actually constantly connected. We just don't notice it. Right. So like you and I, we've been in each other's orbit, whatever, and we're having this conversation now, but you've always been there and I've always been here, and along those lines, if everything's connected, if you understand the basic metaphysics of it, like theoretically, everything here is connected to the other far-reaching sides of the universe, the other side of the galaxy. So what that means is that if I want to change the world, I don't need to rearrange things externally. I just need to make a simple shift internally, and the whole universe changes. Right. So when I look at these conflicts and everything going on in the world, rather than, again, getting reactionary and getting on the pendulum, I center myself and say, okay, so what are we going to do? Right. And with that said, there's another side to it. And again, the opposition, the pendulum. Some people approach this, I think, selfishly, or egocentrically, where I've seen some people who are oblivious to external factors, who don't care about others and just focus on themselves. And sometimes I feel like it's, I don't agree with that, basically. I could tell you a funny scenario. So, I've done sales and a bunch of stuff. So you speak with a lot of people. And sometimes you hear something once, you're like, oh, that's weird. But then you hear it like a dozen times. You're like, what's going on here?
Right.
So I was basically canvassing. I was fundraising for a nonprofit. So I'd stand on the streets of New York and get people to stop and talk to me and basically give me their credit card on the street, become a monthly member to an environmental group. Right. So again, speaking with thousands of people. Now, I would stop people. I'd be like, hey, what's up? Come, let's talk about the rainforest. And some people would genuinely tell me, I do yoga. And like, you hear that once, you're like, oh, that's kind of weird. But then you hear that a dozen times, you're like, what a weird response. What a strange response to talking about saving tigers or something,
Right.
At least one guy I know came back. He walked down the street, came back, and he's like, I heard what I just said. He's like, I'm sorry. He's like, that's ridiculous. At least the cognizance to realize that. So yeah, I do my best to stay humble and not just be like an egomaniac about it. But it is really important to realize everything you want in the world. What are the shifts I can make internally? How can I act from a centered place rather than just reacting to everything that's happening to me? Mm-hmm. So then, yeah, in terms of, bringing it back to the kids and stuff too, it's a long road. It hasn't been easy. It's not what I thought, life hasn't exactly gone as planned. But again, I think the best thing as a parent we can do is teach them how to think rather than what to think. Right. And that's very much how I was raised. I said I was Unitarian Universalist. It's basically kind of Christian based, but we basically take from all religions, so it's very Eastern and exposed to Buddhism and native religions and all this other stuff. But yeah, so I was just taught how to kind of question everything and formulate a path from there.
Yeah, that again, so many thoughts. The idea of looking at various different religions and saying, okay, what's the truth? Mm-hmm. Right. To put it into a perspective that is more tangible. There are certain movements that exist in martial art, right? Like you know, the wrist lock that goes this way against the lapel grab. That exists in every martial art. Do you know why?
Yep.
Because it works. Okay. And if it exists
Yep.
in every martial art and it works, therefore we can conclude that it is true. Right.
Mhm.
So I think that the thought that I had when you were saying that about looking at various religious paths or disciplines or whatever we choose to call them is, what is the truth that's inherent in all these things? And the truth lies in the commonalities, not in the things that we fight over.
Mhm.
You know, when people are
Yep.
warring, literally murdering each other, you know, en masse, in over a religious belief, I don't care which side you're on, you've got it wrong if you think God told me to kill you because you don't agree with me, right? And that just
Exactly.
that has
Correct.
never ever made sense to me, and it's because it doesn't make sense, you know. And I feel like that, um, to tie that back into this theme that we've had going with this whole time is we're really all the same. We're all an expression of
Mhm.
this same fundamental thinking stuff. And for me to go to war
Yep.
with you is to go to war against myself,
Exactly.
right? And so, for me, there's that. The truth is in the commonalities. You know, the truth is in the ability for us to have this conversation and talk about, you know, Jackson Pollock and Van Halen and Mario Andretti and see that there's a line across all of those things that makes sense because it's the same pattern. And you said it best. I think it's recognition of pattern. And this thought literally just occurred to me like a download as we're talking about it. If what you said earlier is, the mark of intelligence is pattern recognition, and we are all formed from this same intelligent substance, this thinking stuff, then we are by definition a series of patterns looking to harmonize with each other. And I don't know if that made any sense, and I reserve the right to recall it later, but that's like what came through me just then while I was, um, ruminating on what you said. Which leads me to this question for you. Are you familiar with the work of Neville Goddard?
Um, yeah, not thoroughly familiar, but I'm familiar with the name, and I'm sure I've read some of his works. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure if you name like one of his books, I'm like, oh, I've read that. Yep.
Um, the one that's coming to my mind right now is The Power of Awareness.
Okay.
And also Feeling is the Secret. That's usually where I would start people who want to know about Neville. But there are, in excess of 200 recorded lectures in his own voice that are on YouTube. Neville was born in 1905, died in 1972. And so there was not a lot of recordings of, there's no video in existence of him. And there's like maybe a dozen photos, but there's all this audio recording that happened in the last years of his life because he would openly encourage people, like Grateful Dead style, to take this new technology of the handheld tape recorder
Mm-hmm.
and bring it to the lecture and record it. And a lot of that has survived.
That's great.
I think that you would really dig his stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're interested, when we're done, I can send you some links to some stuff that I think you would be more interested in than others as a good jumping off point.
Yep.
But the essential, like if I boiled Neville's approach and his ideology down to a single phrase, it's imagining creates reality. And the God of Scripture is our awareness of being.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, something earlier about shifting into different, um,
Yep.
perspectives or different state. He would call that, and this is how I say it too, it's assuming a different state. He would call that the law of assumption. And it's like, if I
Mm-hmm.
want things to be different, I must become someone different. Okay, who is that person? How do they conduct themselves? What would it be like to be that person? Can I assume the feeling of that desire or that wish as already being fulfilled? And if I can do that and hold that state, the world will mold itself around me to reflect that state. You know, again, Kybalion, as within, so without.
Yep.
Man,
Absolutely.
I had no idea this is where this conversation was going. So grateful right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the best laid plans. I mean, so those books, I'm sure they're in the and even the Power of Awareness. I know even recently, it's in the thousands of books that are on my Amazon wish list.
Mm,
And I know I've heard and seen some of this stuff. Um, and yeah, absolutely, it makes me think, of course, of Alan Watts. Right, we're just the universe observing itself, And it's also important, we're all just manifestations of God. We're all, if you believe that, okay, if you believe that God is everywhere, you realize that you are part of God. Like, I'm not an egomaniac. I know I am not God in and of itself, but I also am God as I'm part of it,
Yeah.
right? That also means, though, that your enemies, your opposition, the people who you don't like, the guy who cut you off, it's all manifestations of God.
Yep.
And then from there, you're able to, and that's a big part of it too. Like my father, I used to think he was very cynical, and I was, I ebbed and flowed I went from very positive to very negative, and then I was like, okay, in my adolescence, kind of, and then back to being kind of positive. And it's interesting now when you look at mental health and self development and stuff, they're making more of a push for neuroscience, and they're realizing that your brain actually seeks this homeostasis, right? So I mean, just not again tangent, but the whole positive thinking movement. So I consider myself solution oriented,
Mhm.
but to say, good vibes only, it's a recipe for disaster, basically, right? Because what you're really saying is that I think everything is actually negative, and I have to transmute it into some positive thought in my mind when I don't really believe that everything's good. On the same token, again, your brain seeks this homeostasis. So what happens is, things are hard, you're hungry, you're cold, so you start getting these depressed hormones. And then to kind of prevent us from just giving up, we have things like serotonin and joy and happiness and stuff and dancing. But then you start getting too happy, and your brain's like, hold on, there's saber-tooth tigers out there,
Right.
and you go through this ebb and flow. And really, you want to try to maintain this homeostasis to some extent. So again, when my dad died, it was like a flood of lessons, all these things coming in. And my point is, I used to think he was very cynical, and then I realized he was just a realist in that sense. So now in this stage of my life, I'm really appreciating realism as a place to kind of work your magic, really understanding like, hey, there's left, there's right, there's up and down, what are you going to do?
Yeah. You to that point, I'm in several different Facebook groups that are related to the kind of stuff that we're talking about. A couple of them are very centered around Neville's teachings and that sort of stuff. And someone in a post or a message thread or something was asking for help about money, and you could tell, and whoever it was, English was not their native language, so it was kind of difficult to decipher what they were saying. And I tangent on this. I never criticize anyone
Same.
who English isn't their first language for
Yep.
having bad English, because if you want to compare my ability to speak, say, Farsi,
Yep. Exactly.
Swahili, or
Yep.
Czech to their
Yep.
ability to speak English, I got none. So I'm not going to criticize you. I'm going to seek to understand you, right? Like I have a pretty good command of English language. I can figure out what you're meaning rather than criticize you for an attempt to express it in a novel language. But anyway, this person in this very strange collection of words was expressing that they needed help with abundance and money. And the only response that I had was, well, what are you currently doing to earn money?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Which is a valid question, because like you said earlier, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I was having a conversation with another person earlier today that, like, there's a I will sell my time to get money, or I will solve a problem to get money, and those are like really the two places that we can come from. The people who sell their time for money, those are the ones who are perpetually in a state of lower abundance or even poverty, right? But the people who solve problems, they're increasing life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I asked that question, I got dogpiled because of people who have a limited understanding of what Neville teaches, or like Neville never said anything about you have to earn money. You don't have to work to earn money. You have to align with the frequency and assume the position. And like, okay, the people who are answering have less knowledge than the person who's asking the question. Because the person who's asking the question is coming in saying, I am genuinely ignorant of how to use these tools or these methods or these principles or of this
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. Can you please help guide me? And my first attempt was to connect with them in a place that made sense to them so that we could start I could start being that one person in the woods who's helping the mass.
Yep.
Then literally the crabs in the bucket came and tried to pull us both back down because they have this much of an understanding of what the teaching actually entails. And I'm coming in with this much application of that same knowledge to help to shine a light on the problem and help this person learn something. But that ego driven spiritual superiority stuff comes in, and like I felt the pull on my ego too. And I was like, okay, my initial response was to be like, okay, how much money do you have, person who says you never said you had to earn money? Because I'm looking at your profile and you look broke.
Yep.
But like, and I recognize that as, okay, that's a part of me
Mm-hmm.
that is showing up and reminding me that I don't want to be on that path, right? All that
Mm-hmm.
to get back together to the idea what you were saying earlier about we're all an expression of God, right? And Neville would say that everyone, the whole vast world, direct quote, the whole vast world is yourself pushed out. What
Yep.
you see is, end quote. What we see is dependent on our perception and the meaning that we assign to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So good vibes only, yeah, that's something to. I'm looking for the good vibes in the situation, but
Yep.
I'm also acknowledging that not every vibe in the situation is going to be good. And
Mm-hmm.
if I want more good, I find that good and I pursue that good or I connect to it in whatever way. But that doesn't mean that there are no bad vibes, and I will refuse to experience bad vibes because, like, one of the laws of the universe is this law of rhythm. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the tide comes back. It cannot always be high tide. It cannot always be, day follows night. It has to be that way. And if these cycles and these rhythms weren't in place, then life as we understand it wouldn't exist as we understand it, right? If the earth stopped turning and there was no longer a sunrise and a sunset, one side would freeze and the other side would burn.
Yep. Absolutely. Again, a flood of thoughts. It's so much, and all we have is time in life. But I believe we're talking about some really important stuff here, and I'm still figuring it out. Of course, I don't have it all figured out,
All are.
and kind of diving into it too. What I could tell you, because I know like a bit of what the podcast is about here. This has been a quest that I've been on for a while, right? And I basically got fairly recently divorced, right? Major transition. I'm like 2 years into it after almost 12 years being married. One of the roughest, most brutal things, and I'm still figuring stuff out. And one of the issues I believe is that I'm somebody who looks for the problem. I look for the difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
You know that I had my moving company and I loved it because I was just solving problems every day. Somebody's like, "Oh, I'm stressed." I'm like, "I got you." Here's the invoice. And but my wife wasn't exactly on the same page. And again, I don't want to say anything ill about her ever by any means, but just a difference that we had in terms of perspective and approach. And I realized I can be tough to deal with, jumping into every single problem and be like, "Oh, give me problems, give me problems." It's overwhelming, and I have to watch myself too and say, "Hey, does my life really need to be this difficult? Did I have to make my life this difficult?" And so as I'm figuring stuff out, on one hand, they say you have to get uncomfortable, in fitness, like you have to challenge your body for growth.
Mm-hmm.
The other hand, there's a lot to be said for what you can do from a place of comfort. There's a lot to be said for what you can do from kind of situating your life and removing some obstacles.
Here we
And
go.
yeah, no, exactly. So it, kind of, I believe it's important to have an awareness, but not to let it become I'm at a loss for word, but pathology or whatever in terms of how you view the world. It's an age-old question is like, hey, if all this stuff is so great and all these Instagram guys who are like, "Oh, I was homeless yesterday and now I'm making $1 million," and you're asking yourself like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? The reality is part of why those stories are so extraordinary is because they're so rare. It's not that easy. It's not that common. And in some ways, if you look at the ebb and flow, and again, comparison's so dangerous, but some people, the guy who's homeless living in his car, the guy has no liabilities versus the guy who's struggling to keep his house together and run his business and hemorrhaging funds. So my point is you have to just kind of be aware of this stuff so you can navigate accordingly.
Sure.
And you want to challenge yourself, but also, take care of yourself as well.
Definitely. And I think to that point, I think a lot of folks without money think that money would solve all the problems. And yes, the problems that you have that need to be solved by money will be solved by the money. Also, the problems that you don't have that come about as a result of having money will now be present in your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that money, and this could be true of anything, but it's not that it will eliminate problems. It will eliminate a specific set of problems to which that thing is the solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you no longer have to be concerned about, am I going to pay my rent? Now you have to be concerned about, am I going to be able to make payroll?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
which is that's to me, that's those are harmonious problems, right? They're the same sort of problem, just expressed at a different pitch, so to speak.
Yep.
I think you make a good point there. I want to divert a little bit and direct this a little bit more into how your spiritual journey that we've been talking about influences your approach to fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people that I'm connecting with in this show. It goes back to being a better dad by being a better man kind of stuff, right? And
Yep.
also
Mm-hmm.
to that point, since we're talking about the various laws of the universe and rhythm and everything that goes along with that, we have masculine and we have feminine. And
Mm-hmm.
um, from my perspective, there is a lot of on social media and whatnot, there is a lot of negative connotation to the concept or the principle of masculinity in general.
Yep.
And I'm talking to you, you're a strong guy, you're a martial artist, you're a thinker. Um, so I guess there's it's either two questions or two parts of the same question. Talk about your spiritual journey, how it influences you as a father. And since you have, a boy and a girl,
Yep.
how does that come into play? And also masculinity and all of that stuff. So there's another ball. I throw it to you. You play.
Two huge topics. Two huge topics, right? So first off, spirituality. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? So again, my dad was born Jewish. His mom was Ukrainian and his dad was Austrian. I'm a third generation New Yorker. But my dad, he he lived a whole life before I was born. He had his master's in English. He used to be a teacher. Retired from that, and he was a psychotherapist for my whole life. So his basic take on it was, God wouldn't allow a world with so much suffering. All right. That was kind of his take on it. But it's funny because he was also like the most kind, loving person you'll ever meet. It's not like he was lacking God, in that sense. And then my mom, she raised me Unitarian Universalist, which just exposed me to all this stuff and world issues. And so a big part of my religion, I like to think of like Wakantanka, kind of the native ideal of the great mystery, right? I feel like there's such a need to define things in religion instead of realizing like, hey, there's some stuff that we don't know, and that's okay. Just keep living in the question. And then another major influence was Jita Krishnamurti. Not
Mm-hmm.
sure if you're familiar with it. Yep. I know Bruce Lee read him a lot. My brother gave me, I read his book when I was in Japan when I was 13. My brother gave it to me.
Mm-hmm.
Think on These Things, one of my favorite books. And I've read many of his things since.
Another huge fan of Jita Krishnamurti is Marty Gallagher, the powerlifting coach,
Yep.
the legend of powerlifting coach. And if you
Yep. Absolutely.
sit down and talk to Marty for more than about 30 minutes or so, things related to Krishnamurti will come up, particularly
Yep.
about all the mystics arguing and running over the goat in the Jeep. You know that story?
No, not exactly, but yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
a bunch of mystics in a car, and they're arguing over these like conceptual ideas of spirituality and all that, and they're driving along and they hit a goat and kill it, and they were so busy arguing over that no one noticed that they had run over this goat,
yep.
except the person who wasn't involved in that, who wasn't an ascended master. And it's obviously metaphorical, but
Yep.
anyway, I
Yeah, I
digress.
mean that's basically his philosophy. He was chosen as like the reincarnation of a spiritual leader, kind of like the Dalai Lama of whatever that religion was. And they basically took him from his home and they educated him internationally and put him in all these temples and these palaces and stuff. And then when he came of age, he was like, this is all nonsense. It's like, this is all divisive nonsense. And he really talks about kind of the oneness. And, it also makes me think I was lucky enough to go to South Africa twice. And the first time I went was in December 96. Now, apartheid technically ended in April 96, at least, on the books legally. And I was lucky to go there because I got to witness that it was basically like going back in time, what I could imagine the US must have been like during segregation and whatnot. Okay. And what you see is just the oldest trick in the book, divide and conquer. They had the whites, the coloreds, and the blacks. And they basically, the coloreds would kind of help oppress the blacks, but almost wish they were
I
white.
need to know the definitions of each of those.
It was completely a color test. They would put you against a paper bag kind of thing and say, what shade are you?
About the paper bag test. That was something, and
Yep.
I'm from the South, and so
Yep.
like the town that I grew up in is literally the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yep.
And one of the criteria was, where did the enslaved person, where were they assigned? And if they were dark, they were in the slave quarters and they were out picking cotton or doing whatever. And if they were
Yep, exactly.
past the paper bag
the house
test,
Negro and
they
the
were
house
allowed
Negro
to
and
be
the
in
field
the
Negro.
house. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're hip to all this stuff too. But there are stories of literally like twins being separated, having to live in different parts of town because of different complexions, right? And what you see is just the oldest trick in the book, divide and conquer, and you see that very much at play here, right? Now, I'm not saying there's not oppressive forces and whatnot, but at the end of the day, it's important to realize, like, hey, this guy who maybe had trying to put a boot on your neck, it's your brother.
Yeah.
And I also believe that, being very literal, I grew up with kind of revolutionary ideals, but being very literal, revolution just means things are going in a circle. Right. And what you find is that people often have to do such heinous things to get into the power of their oppressor that they become the oppressor. So I believe what we really need is evolution rather than revolution in that sense. And again, so spiritually, I've been on this journey, and I went to Institute for Integrative Nutrition, like I said, and one of the best things I learned there we call primary food, right? So again, I was a fitness instructor, and I knew like nutrition was a component. So I wanted to take some nutrition classes. I found this program. I didn't really know what it was. I signed up. The classes started the next day. I thought I was going to be like in labs and stuff, and it wasn't that at all, right? It was funny. The class was like 95% female, and it was funny because I was in a very like militant stage in my life, and luckily, I do have a strong empath side, and I was able to kind of really find more strength in that. And what we talked about, though, is what we call primary food, right? So sometimes not being healthy isn't just about like not eating enough broccoli, right? And primary food comes down to four main components. It's basically your exercise, your physical practice, your career, your relationships, which is a huge one for me because I believe it's like your relationship with everything, and your spirituality. So spirituality, I always consider it like an endless well of resource, right? When you're in your darkest, when you're in your worst. I just read Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl too, and he, kind of goes into some of this stuff. But spirit is a way to tap into this power in those darkest moments. In terms of religion, I basically, again, I grew up opposed to religion because you look at a lot of the worst things that have happened, and it's often been in like the name of God, right? Even the word God, I hesitate to use it because it was written by conquerors. It's like a Germanic word. It's like, kind of, so instantly you say God and people picture like, this man in the sky who's, exerting his will kind of thing. I use it now, just colloquially so people understand what I'm talking about. Right? But, and I also, growing up mixed, it was always, I was in constant conflict, right? I had a lot of Black and African pride, but I was also kind of like shown that I was a lesser in society. You mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. The first time I took the train down to Atlanta to visit family when I was 6, as soon as we got out of the train, I saw a Klan march, and some people don't realize that. They're like, oh, racism's dead. I'm like, oh, I don't know where you're standing from, but not at all. And so in my thinking, I'm like, and then on the white side, like all this great history and like, oh, we run the world. But I'm like, these guys have done monstrous things, So my point is, first off, I look at the planet, I look at oneness. And the way I see it, Earth is just one big organism. And oftentimes when we have these deviations and this destructive stuff, it's basically like cancer cells erupting, right? Because I look at things very visually. So now I'm like, okay, even if these guys are right, even if their God is the one, how could I possibly accept their religion when it's brought to me so violently?
Right.
Right? Even if it's 100% right, I cannot accept this, right? But then it's funny, I'm surrounded by a lot of great influences in my life who are religious. And I'm like, well, no coincidence, it's got to be something going on here. And then I go to Ethiopia and I see uh, churches, mosques, and synagogues on the same block. And I'm like, oh, wow, nobody taught me about this stuff,
Right.
you know? And what I realized actually in some ways, and again, my mom, she's an anthropologist, she could tell you a lot more about this, but in some ways, it's almost like religion was taken from people, bastardized, and then brought back, right? But like in terms of Christianity, for example, and the original teachings of it,
Right.
it was almost like taken, used for political gains, and then forced upon people, when ultimately it was the religion of their ancestors, right?
Right.
So, and again, I have mixed thoughts on religion. I think a lot of it is just people trying to, it's like if I try to express something to you, we're naturally going to exaggerate as we tell a story, right? Just to try to convey to you the experience that I had, Oh, I went to this show and it was like, oh, it's so amazing. It's like, you're like, okay, whatever. I'm going to, make a story. My point is, so obviously I have a critical mind, right? As I'm looking at this stuff. For me at this point, religion is your routine, right? It doesn't matter if you go to church on Sunday and then you're doing war crimes on Monday, right? It's like, what do you do every day? What do you wake up and how do you spend your time? And to me, that's what I'm considering my religion at this point, my connection with God.
As exemplified by the expression, he goes to the gym religiously.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And well, that I've never thought about it in those terms before, but yeah, that makes huge amount of sense because what I do consistently is a reflection of what I believe.
Exactly.
Uh, Ultimately, a reflection of what I believe or who I believe I am.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And to take that all the way back to to the Moses and the Ten Commandments, I am that I am. And
Yep.
that's the that's the Neville idea of it, right? I am is God's name. My awareness of being, that is God, for lack of a better
Yep.
term. And all of Neville's stuff is pulled out of interpretation of the Christian Bible, but it would be considered heretical by definitely by pretty much everyone around the area that I'm in who are, uh, evangelical Southern Baptist, that type of stuff, or Catholics as well, So and
Yeah.
that's not to I'm not
I'm with you.
I'm not
Yep.
talking badly about any of those people or their beliefs. I'm just drawing the distinction between the way Neville would interpret those scriptures and the way other people interpret it. But ultimately, I think that you're right, and that to me that all ties into the idea that if I am is the name of God, and that's my consciousness, and we are this consciousness expressing itself, that's the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And the patterns that recur are the truth, and the people who fight over it are perverting their own spirituality, really.
Yep. Yep. And that's very much I always say, dig deeper, right? Anytime I'm trying to figure something out and I don't know what's going on, I just say, dig deeper. There's another layer to this.
Yeah.
And I try to look at the essence of things. And I think about like my dad, for instance, he used to watch debates on mute and just watch their body language
Ooh,
and watch how they're expressing themselves.
that's
So
powerful.
when I think about like the essence of man, this is part of why, some people, I'm not trying to play both sides of the fence here, right? I know I'm not going to please everybody, but what I've learned just from experience is that, Pavel used to always talk about too, under stress resort to training,
Yep.
right? And so when I look at people, people on the left, people on the right, a lot of ideals, but you'd be surprised who will actually run into a burning building to get you
Mm-hmm.
when you know stuff hits the fan. So, and then also, you know, maybe one day I will, maybe one day I won't. You know, the duality of man, right? And but again, so that's where it comes down to, hey, what are you doing every day? Because you said, like you said, it's based on your beliefs, and it's also what's compelling you, right? Because you're trained, you know, not every day is easy, but you keep pushing forward with that belief because you know it's what drives you as well.
Yeah, and to that point, when I say belief like that, I mean it's like, who do I really believe that I am? You know, and to like give a tangible example of that, we've all seen or heard examples of people who were impoverished and they lived in the projects, or they lived in the trailer park, whatever, because those are both
Mm-hmm. Yep.
operational poverty, right?
Yep.
Then they win, you know, $5 million in the lottery. And then a year later, they're in a worse position financially than they were beforehand, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so why is that? And it's difficult to comprehend unless you accept the fact that while they were living in poverty, they they were in poverty in the first place because that's who they believe they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's who, or that's what they believe existence is. And you dump in the solution to poverty, they will revert back to poverty
Yep.
because that's who they believe they are. You know, it's, is it, I don't think I can do it as an exact quote, so I'm going to paraphrase it. This comes from Tony Robbins, that like the strongest element in our human existence is the need for us to be the identity that we have, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you talk about who's going to run into the burning building to save you, um, the people with the loudest voice that say they would are most likely the one that wouldn't. You know,
Yep.
I saw a guy on YouTube the other day. I think his channel's called Casino King. He's like this rancher guy with this big beard and a cowboy hat, and he's smoking a cigar, and it's like a real life Sam Elliott character, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
doles out wisdom and stuff. And and he was talking about um the you will not change until you believe that you're someone else, essentially is how it is. And if you want to change, you have to be someone else. And but like the way that he presented it would, because as I say that again, there's another Instagram meme that we've all seen and read before. You know,
Yeah.
it's like God is love. Okay, yeah, we've heard that before. But if you stop and just analyze that, right? But the way he presented that, something you said just triggered me thinking about him, and it was very interesting. He's like the the loudest man in the room is never the most dangerous man in the room.
Yep.
From a martial arts standpoint, I do not know a single person who's ever been in martial art for more than 3 months who would disagree with that statement, right?
Yep.
Um, um, even if even if we look at somebody like Muhammad Ali, right? He
Yep.
got loud after he was great, or after he
Mm-hmm.
proved his greatness, right?
Yep.
And he also, I believe, realized that the more he ran his mouth, and I say that with absolute endearment and respect, that the more he did that, the more money he would make. You know,
Yep.
it's showmanship at that point. And did he really believe it? Yes. Um, but a person could be very quiet and never say anything and have that same belief. Case in point, someone like Mike Tyson in his prime, right? Mike Tyson
Yep.
didn't have to tell you he was the best. He would just knock you the fuck out, right?
Yep. Yep.
Ali, I think, realized that the more he talked and the more entertaining he was, the more money he could make. True, too. But then also the more, if we look at the the racial climate at the time, the more good he could do for more people by
Yep.
coming on. And you know, it because I'm old enough to remember when he was still actively in the ring, right? And you know, growing up in the South where I was, there was a lot of things that were said about him being a cocky, fill in the blank with whatever racial slur you want to throw in there after that. And
Yep.
I remember my dad saying at one point, yeah, he's cocky, but no one can beat him.
Yep.
So is he being cocky, or is he just telling the truth? And and I think that he recognized, and I know we're on a tangent now too, but
I'm with you.
together, I think that he recognized that he was in a position that a position of power that no other black man at the time could occupy. Because he wasn't just out there peacefully protesting like so many were, and God love him for that. But he was in a position where he could go and say, yes, I will dominate you in the ring, no matter what your ethnic background, any of that sort of stuff. And I am a man,
Yep.
I'm a person, and I have value, and all the rest of us do too. So I think that was a big part of his appeal. And I think he took that and ran with it. I don't know that it was um, as preconceived as what it might sound like with me saying that, but I think he recognized that and said, this is my purpose, not just to knock people out, but to raise people up.
Man, so many things. Let me try to pull it in here too, right? So first off, it was funny. It's one of my pet peeves in like MMA. Guys talking too much smack, and like Forrest Griffin said, he said there's nothing worse than the guy who talks smack and backs it up, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing more annoying than that guy. But generally, when you see the guys posturing, I know a lot of it's for the show, but from a martial perspective, I'm like, it's just a bad strategy. One of my favorite fighters is Fedor Emelianenko. I actually got to meet him twice. I actually did security for him once, which is funny, doing security for the best fighter in the world.
Yeah.
But he never even looked at his opponent. He was like, it's nothing personal. He never liked to make eye contact.
Right.
He was very humble. I remember before one of his big fights, they were like, oh, this guy said he's going to bash your head and destroy you and all this stuff. Like, what do you have to say in response? He's like, well, all I have to say is, Happy New Year and have a nice day. Yeah. That was his response, and the humble champ, which we appreciate. What's interesting about how, and I think it's, what came first, chicken or the egg? On one hand, it's a good practice. The other hand, the person who talks smack is setting themselves up for that defeat. I mean, the reason I'm opposed to it, because you're basically giving your opponent fuel to actually want to beat you now, and you're putting unnecessary pressure on yourself, right? What Ali, he's the people's champ in that sense. So what's interesting, I always look at the judo of it, right? When you look at a conflict and you're pushing and pulling, sometimes people keep trying to push, and it's like that door says pull, man. Like you can't push it, and you gotta shift your fulcrum a little bit. So he was able to use his voice, but he had the world behind him. He was speaking for so many people. So he was able to use that as a strength in that sense. And it makes me think that's part of why I love ninjutsu, right? So to me, ninjutsu primarily means two things. I mean, first off, my dad always taught me to root for the underdog. So that's maybe part of why I gravitated towards that. Of course, there's like, the deceptiveness and all this right. The magic tricks and all that stuff. But ultimately, for me, it's two things. It's endurance, right? Never quitting. And two, it's using what you have to win, no matter what, to defeat an otherwise stronger opponent. And that's really why I love martial arts, right? So you look at MMA, you look at Muay Thai, and of course, there's a lot to be said for simply being stronger than your opponent. But that's not always the case. It's not always an option, right? But you have to stay dangerous and know your strengths and weaknesses and figure out, hey, how can I win here? So yeah, I like the whole just kind of flipping and saying, hey, how can I use this to my advantage? How can I leverage this situation to win? Now you were also mentioning masculinity and femininity.
Yeah.
And to me, that's so I embrace like the strong. I think there's beauty in the masculine and the feminine, right? And there's the two sides, and I have my feminine side, and I'm also very happy to be a man and lucky and blessed. And I look at my son and my daughter, love them both to death, right? Such unique souls. And then of course, my daughter, daddy's girl kind of thing. We have a special connection. My son and I have a very unique connection as well. But one of the interesting things, kind of watching my daughter and just looking at the world and seeing history, there's a truth to women being oppressed, right? There's a truth to them suffering violence and other. There's a good line in True Detective where she was like, do you know the difference between men and women? She's like, one can kill the other with their bare hands, and but then I look and it's like, it's so funny that, like they say, the meek shall inherit the earth. I was watching that Predator movie, Prey. It's fantastic. Yep. And you see, it's by definition, the weak are going to rise because they're overlooked, basically, and they're not weak. They're just overlooked. We're all equals in that sense. And that's the funny thing about it too. So many people, they don't realize they're creating what they oppose. It's
Exactly.
like it's like you're the reason this organization exists. No, these guys that you hate, they were created because of you.
Yeah.
So it's funny to see how that works, and it's also very confusing, So, and I hesitate. This is something I've wanted to talk about for a long time, and I haven't necessarily. But basically, people call it confusing times, right? Transgender issues, or not issues, the debate and all this other stuff. I have trans friends. I have people who were friends um, who became trans, like I didn't know, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, surprise. Other people who I met them, after they decided to transition, whatever the case is. My point is, first off, I mean, I don't believe nature is so black and white necessarily. Like that's one thing to understand about like evolution, for example, right? Um, we didn't evolve. Evolution didn't make us better than anything else. It just made us more able to survive, right? But when the nukes go off and the roaches are still here, like who's better at that point?
Exactly.
Now, again, I value more than a roach per se, but again, nature is brutal and it's designed for survival,
Sure.
right? In terms of even beliefs, everyone talks about limiting beliefs. It's like, no, everybody just has beliefs that have enabled them to survive thus far, right? So I have a lot of thoughts on it. On one hand, I'm a strong believer, like one of my favorite quotes, live your own life because you will definitely die your own death. Right. So I always strongly encourage people to do whatever they want to do as long as it's not hurting anybody. On the other hand, I have compassion for whether it's good or bad or whatever, for somebody feeling so uncomfortable in their own skin and, the difficulties of that, I have compassion for that. But again, I think about the burning building situation again. People are so quick to vilify, oh, this person and their beliefs. And it's like, but you go to these circles and they'll feed you, they'll give you water, they'll take care of you. So it's like, you're not my enemy in that sense. And when I ask myself, what are the real problems that we face in this world? For me, it's always been murder, rape, war, homelessness, people starving to death. New York City, richest place in the world, 100,000 homeless children, does not make sense. So yes, you could say, oh, it's it's a mutilation or whatever of our core values kind of thing. But I'm like, we don't have the same goal here. If you
Right.
think this person is your enemy, right? Um,
And it's
and
that's
then
the
that goes,
of like, is it the right answer? It depends on the question. 7 is a great answer unless you're asking me what the capital of the United States is.
yep,
Right.
exactly, yep. Yeah, and it brings, this is the whole thing with war and tying it into the masculine. Um, I've pushed myself so hard that I've broken myself in some ways, right? And this is the whole thing, and talking about being a man and all this stuff. Looking back, there's some things I would have done differently. But I think this is a big part of it where as a man, as a dad, we're told that we need to sacrifice, right? Now, yes, you do have to sacrifice to some, two sides, right? So, okay, yes, you have to sacrifice to some extent. If you chase 2 rabbits, you're going to catch nothing, right? But you shouldn't have to sacrifice yourself.
Right.
You shouldn't have to sacrifice who you are as a person, right? There were years, one of my biggest regrets, there were years, in the restaurant, I'd come home at 3 a.m., wake up at 7 to take the kids to school. And I did that every day for years, just no sleep. And it was ridiculous how I was even managing the strength that I needed to do that. But then, of course, I faced an extreme burnout from that.
Right.
Right. But society tells you, like, hey, just keep putting your nose to the grind kind of thing. And so yeah, I think it's tough I think it's, again, I'm not going to, save your tears, but it's tough for men, in many ways in this world. And patriarchy, I believe it damages women, of course, directly, but it also damages men, right? And then tying this in, like I look at, I have complex thoughts on war, for example. I'm very anti-war, but I also consider myself a warrior, and I have ideals, and I can go on about that as well. But ultimately, you know, I ask myself, okay, if my goal is preservation of life, like maybe killing the opposition isn't quite getting to my goal.
Right.
Right. And I'm saying that just in terms of reshifting what masculine is and what it means to be a man, and how sometimes pulling a trigger, is the easy thing to do. But how am I ever going to solve you look at these issues around the world, how are they ever going to be solved if we can't get along with our neighbors?
Exactly. Exactly. I have a point that I want to say in regards to that, and then I just noticed what time it is. I usually end these by doing a 3 or 4 rapid fire things. So I want to say this little bit, and then we'll do rapid fire, and we'll wrap it up if that's cool with you.
Yep, absolutely.
Um, you said the thing about pulling the trigger being the easy way. I think I agree with the spirit of that, and I think that um, a better choice of words might be not the easy way, but the convenient way,
Mhm.
or the way that ends the immediate problem without taking into consideration the ripple effect that goes along with that, right? And I have been and we haven't talked about this particular aspect of parenting at all, and I'm sure that we could probably go down a rabbit hole with it too, but I have been uh, I've been increasingly more vocal in my social media presence and otherwise. As my son is 5 now, as I've learned more about childhood development, brain development, emotional maturity,
Mhm.
regulation of emotions, all of those sorts of things. And I've come to the point where I I'm firmly believing and ready to debate the topic with anyone who comes at the 180 opposing view that things like because I said so, or
Mhm.
quick harsh punishment, or hitting a child, spanking a child because
Mhm.
they're doing something at age 5 that is developmentally appropriate, all the stuff that goes back to children should be seen and not heard. I think that that is at the root of a lot of the mental health issues that men have, or people in general have. But much like pulling the trigger is the easy answer or the quick answer,
Mhm.
smacking the shit out of a child, that'll get him to stop right now.
Mhm.
But let's fast forward 40, 50 years into the future, and you're in a nursing home alone, and your kid won't
Yep.
come see you. If he does, you do something that he doesn't like, and he smacks the shit out of you. The tables are turned at that point, right? And so I think that what you said, I felt it a lot because the the fastest, easiest, most efficient answer to a problem is sometimes not the correct answer to a problem or the most beneficial answer to a problem. And I think that if life's purpose is to expand and more fully express itself, shutting anything down from pulling the trigger against the enemy, but because okay, I killed that guy, but all the rest of them are still there, and more importantly, the driving belief and philosophy that is causing us to be at odds in the first place is still there. I think all of that is intimately tied to each other, and I think that the least masculine thing that a dad can do is to sacrifice himself. I get up, I go to work, I come home, and no one's appreciating me and no one's grateful for it. And if you don't do what I say, then I'll be the heavy handed disciplinarian. I think that is all of the elements of masculinity that could be expressed as a strength that are being expressed as a weakness. That is a literal expression of weakness by attempting to assert my dominance over someone rather than meet them from a place of compassion and understand developmentally where they are, say, as a child, and guiding them along the way. That is like the weakest thing that a man can do. um and I think that it's programmed into us societally that like this is what men do. And I'm fond of saying this is the thought that triggered this whole deal when you were talking earlier. I'm fond of saying that sacrifice is necessary,
Mhm.
suffering is optional, right?
Yep.
When you were doing, drop the kids off at 7 and you don't see them again until 7 the next morning because you're working 16-hour shifts in the restaurant business, which is one of the toughest businesses there is,
Mhm.
um, you were unduly you were unduly suffering as you were sacrificing. And I think that there's a distinction that needs to be made there. Yes, I'm sacrificing time right now that I'm not spending with my son, but he's also at daycare, or not daycare, he's at preschool right now. So that's a sacrifice in the time that we are not spending with each other, but
Mhm.
neither one's suffering as a result of it, right? So it has
Mhm.
to do with allocation of time. So that's just a thought that got triggered there. And we've been stream of conscious this whole time, so there you go. um,
Yep, I'm with it.
and if I may, well, if you had anything to respond to that with, please go ahead. But I do.
No, I keep doing your thing. You know, again, we can go on forever.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into rapid fire then, if that's okay with
Yep,
you.
I'm with you.
All right. The way I like to do this, I'll ask a question. Whatever comes out of your mouth comes out of your mouth. And we move on. Right. What's your favorite holiday? Just for a complete shift.
That's such a loaded question. I'm sorry. I hope it's not a one-word answer.
Doesn't have to be.
But, yeah. So I mean, my birthday is December 21st, which is winter solstice. So it's always just like a big transition for me. I consider every day a holy day. New Year's, on one hand, is just another day. It's also my brother's birthday. It's also the day my dad died. So it's always just like this huge transition. I don't know if I'd say that's my favorite per se, but that's like the most powerful kind of spiritual time of the year for me.
Very cool. What is the single most valuable piece of advice you've ever received?
Like I said, live your own life because you will definitely die your own death. Yep. For many ways, really be true to yourself. And that's something I've been learning too, just really being honest with yourself. It's crucial. Mm-hmm.
Very good. If you could only eat one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I want to say pesto pasta. You know, I love variety though. To me, it's all about just farm fresh. I like variety of experience. So really, it's not necessarily what the food is, but it's really how it's made. Ooh. Just made with love and grown, you know, close to me, and that's what I'm all about.
I like it. Share a funny or heartwarming dad moment.
Oh, I mean, so many. These guys are a constant joy. I'll tell you, witnessing my son, the compassion develop in him when he was young. There was a time where I remember some kids were like almost trying to like mess with some ladybugs or something on a bush. And he was so adamant about, you know, protecting the ladybug. And I'm like, I didn't specifically teach him that, but that's something he was compelled to do. Another day I came home, or he came home from school. He was very upset. And I'm like, oh, what happened? He's like, oh, there's some bullies on the bus, basically. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, were they bullying you? He's like, no, they were bullying other kids. But he was, you know, compelled and felt motivated to do something about that. I was like, man, this is a good soul here.
Definitely. This one more on here. Let's see. What we'll finish with this. And what is a personal mantra or belief that you want to make sure gets instilled into your kids and gets passed on?
Again, I don't want to sound too cliche with like, you know, never quit kind of thing. But you do have to have an element of toughness in this life, especially if you're challenging yourself as you should. So it's not just about working hard, but it's about learning how to challenge yourself in a reasonable way. And again, you know, where I am right now in my life, I think is a good thing for them. Of just, you can't play from the sidelines. You got to get on the field, and again, you can't just stand on the field. You got to make plays. Very good. Know. Yep.
Very good. Cool. Well, Greg, I appreciate you taking some time to come sit down in this conversation. This is not where I thought I would be 2.5 hours ago, but I'm glad where we are. This is very good. So if everybody's listening, thanks a lot for listening. If people want to get in touch with you or find you, give the quick shout out of where they can get to you.
Yeah, it's just Greg Landess. I'm pretty informal right now as I'm going through some stuff. You can find me Koga Greg on IG, you know, but Greg Landess, that's who I am.
Okay. So cool. All right. Thanks a bunch. And thanks for listening, folks.